For nearly 200 years, the stars had promised humanity peace. Since the founding of the Outer Concord, an alliance of 51 species stretching across 900 light-years, humans had built lives among worlds their ancestors had only ever seen as points of light. 16 colonies now carried human names into the dark. Trade routes connected them to species that had once seemed like impossible dreams. The patient, ancient Solven, the mercantile, the reserved, calculating Threll compact, whose territory bordered human space, along a stretch of contested stars nobody had ever quite settled the ownership of. Meridian was humanity's proudest achievement among them. A temperate world in the Galactic system, its continents draped in blue-green forest, its cities built low and wide to leave room for the wilderness humans had, against every prediction, chosen to preserve rather than pave over. 9 million people called it home. It was the kind of place people wrote songs about, not because it was remarkable, but because it was ordinary in a way none of them had ever been allowed to take for granted before. Retired Fleet Admiral Marcus Reyes had visited Meridian 3 times. He was 71 now, silver-haired, with the kind of tired eyes that came from 4 decades of watching young people leave for wars he'd hoped would be the last one. He served on the Joint Defense Council's advisory board these days, spending most of his time in briefings and reports rather than on a bridge. His granddaughter, Sophia, was 9 years old and lived on Meridian with her parents. He spoke to her every week over the relay network. She had just lost her first tooth. She wanted to be a marine biologist, she'd told him, so she could study the strange bioluminescent reefs that ringed Meridian's southern coastline. He had promised to visit again in the spring. The Threll Compact had other plans. The Threll were an old species, older than the Concord itself, older than most of its member worlds' recorded history. They were tall, pale, and elegant in a way that unsettled most humans who met them, with a language built around efficiency rather than warmth, and a governing philosophy that treated the galaxy as a resource ledger to be balanced. For 3,000 years they had expanded, absorbed, and administered, and they had grown accustomed to species eventually accepting their place in that ledger, without much resistance. Humanity had refused to cede to border systems. The Threll Compact's Continuity Council had quietly, formally requested. It was a small refusal, by galactic standards, to thinly populated mining outposts, easily replaceable. Easily negotiated. The Threll did not see it that way. They saw a young species, barely 2 centuries into interstellar life, telling an empire 3 millennia old that it did not owe it anything. The Continuity Council decided this could not stand unanswered. Elena Vasquez was working the overnight shift at Earth's Central Command when the first alerts came through. She was 36. A communications specialist who had spent 14 years monitoring signal traffic from human space without ever once handling anything worse than a shipping delay or a garbled distress call from a civilian freighter. Nothing in those 14 years prepared her for what filled her screen at 03 for 7 hours. A Threll fleet had appeared around Meridian without warning, 240 warships, materializing from a translation corridor no Concord treaty acknowledged existed, forming a perfect, silent ring around the planet. Meridian's small defense flotilla, 11 ships built for search and rescue and light patrol work, was gone within 4 minutes. And then the Threll did something no species in Concord history had ever done in an act of war. They opened a channel, not to Earth, to everyone. The message reached every inhabited world in Concord space simultaneously, translated instantly into every registered language. Continuity Overseer Vesic Thorn, 9 feet of pale, angular authority, his voice modulated into something that carried no inflection at all, appeared on every screen in known space. The humans have forgotten the shape of the galaxy, Vesic Thorn said. They are young. They are undisciplined. They believe refusal is a right rather than a privilege extended to them by those with the patience to allow it. Today, the Threll Compact corrects that belief. Today, every species watching learns what happens to those who mistake our patience for weakness. Marcus Reyes was in his apartment in Geneva when the broadcast began. He turned on his display, expecting the evening's regular briefing feed. Instead, he saw Meridian, his granddaughter's world, ringed by warships that had appeared out of nowhere. He tried to reach the colony. Every channel was blocked. He tried Central Command. No one had answers yet. All he could do, like everyone else on Earth, and on every human world, and on every allied world across the Concord, was watch. The killing did not begin with weapons. It began with landing craft, and soldiers moving through Meridian's low, wide cities with the same calm efficiency the Threll brought to everything. Civilians were gathered into public plazas, the same plazas where, days earlier, children had been playing in the last warm evenings before the autumn rains. And then, while the galaxy watched through a channel the Threll refused to close, the killing began. David Okafer was an aquaculture technician on Meridian's southern coast, 29 years old, married for months, with a wife 6 weeks pregnant with their first child. When Threll soldiers reached his coastal town, he took his wife down into the reef monitoring station's storm shelter, sealed the hatch, and sat with her in the dark, one hand pressed flat against her stomach, listening to the sounds moving through the town above them. The Threll found the shelter within the hour. The broadcast showed what happened next to anyone still watching. It showed elderly researchers begging in languages. The Threll's translation matrices rendered instantly and without mercy. It showed young families trying to run. It showed children too young to understand what was happening to them. The Threll killed with the same unhurried procedural.com they brought to trade negotiations. Overseer Thorne narrated throughout, his voice never rising, never breaking. "Observe their fear," he said, as the broadcast showed a mother shielding to children with her own body. "This is what an undisciplined species produces: fear, chaos, and a mistaken belief that resistance changes an outcome already decided." The killing lasted 71 hours. 9 million people died on Meridian, while the rest of the galaxy watched. On Earth, crowds gathered in public squares around the world, staring up at massive display screens, unable to look away and unable to keep looking. Some wept. Some screamed. Most simply stood in a silence that had no precedent in human history, watching a broadcast that would not end and could not be stopped. Elena Vasquez stayed at her station through all 71 hours. She logged every identifiable casualty she could, because someone needed to, because the alternative was letting 9 million deaths become a statistic with no names attached. She did not sleep. She barely ate. When the broadcast finally ended, she walked outside Central Command, sat down on the concrete steps, and wept until she had nothing left. Marcus Reyes watched every hour of it. He watched the town where Sophia lived burn. He watched the reef monitoring station's location marked, briefly, on a Threll tactical overlay before the feed cut away to another sector of the massacre. When Overseer Thorne delivered his closing statement, "Let this stand as instruction. The matter is now closed." Marcus did not cry. He did not shout. He sat alone in his darkened apartment, staring at a blank screen, and waited for the part of himself that still knew how to move to come back online. On the Concord's central station, representatives of 50 species watched the same broadcast humanity had. Some were horrified. Some were quietly relieved it hadn't been their world. A few, from species with long memories of Threll administration, watched with an expression closer to recognition than shock. None of them spoke out. None of them moved a single ship. When the broadcast ended, the Concord chamber adjourned, and its members returned, within days, to the ordinary business of trade schedules and border disputes, as though nothing that mattered to the wider galaxy had happened at all. There were, in the days that followed, a handful of individual protests. A junior Krelith delegate who resigned her post rather than sit through a routine session as though nothing had changed. A small and largely powerless coalition of border worlds that issued a joint statement condemning the massacre in language careful enough not to actually name the Thrall Compact directly. None of it amounted to anything the Continuity Council needed to take seriously. The junior delegate was quietly reassigned. The joint statement was filed, acknowledged, and forgotten within a news cycle. The machinery of the Concord, built across centuries to prioritize stability over justice whenever the two came into conflict, simply absorbed the massacre the way it had absorbed every atrocity that came before it, and continued turning. If this story's got its hooks in you already, drop a like. It genuinely helps a small channel like this one find new listeners. Okay, let's keep going. Secretary General Aiko Tanaka called an emergency session of the United Earth Council less than a day after the broadcast ended. Representatives from every human nation and colony gathered in the Geneva chamber, faces gray, hands unsteady. Most expected a speech about grief. They expected calls for vigils, for diplomatic condemnation, for an official protest lodged with a concord that had already proven it would do nothing with one. Instead, Tanaka stood at the podium and played, one final time, the closing seconds of Overseer Thorne's broadcast. Let this stand as instruction. Then she looked out at the assembled leaders with an expression that held no visible grief at all, only a stillness that unsettled everyone in the room more than tears would have. They wanted to teach us our place, she said. They wanted every species in this concord to see exactly what happens to a species that says no to the Threll Compact. They have made a mistake tonight, and it is not the one they think they made. She paused, effective immediately. Every human citizen beyond soul space is recalled home. Every ship, every colonist, every trade mission, research station, and diplomatic post. This is not a request. Come home. Come home now. The order went out to every corner of human space within the hour. The galaxy, watching for signs of the fury it expected. Angry broadcasts, formal declarations, demands for justice it assumed would go nowhere. Exactly as every prior grievance against a major power had gone nowhere, instead watched something it had no framework for. Humanity went quiet. Every human ambassador on every Concord world packed their belongings within days and left without explanation, without complaint, without so much as a formal farewell beyond the minimum diplomatic courtesy required. Trade convoys that had run for a generation between human and allied space reversed course. Joint research teams shut down their projects, archived their data, and boarded transports home. Within 3 weeks, there was not a single human being anywhere beyond the boundary of Sol System space. The silence unsettled the Concord more than any protest could have. A species that shouted was a species you understood, a known quantity you could calculate a response to. A species that simply, silently disappeared was something else entirely. Aiko Tanaka stood at the window of her Geneva office, looking up at a night sky she could no longer see past the city's light pollution, and thought about the fact that she had spent her career as a diplomat believing words and treaties were the tools that mattered in a crisis like this. 9 million dead broadcasts across the stars for 71 hours. It made it very clear that words meant nothing to a species that had never needed to listen to them. Her assistant knocked. Admiral Reyes is here. Madam Secretary. Marcus Reyes walked in slower than he had a month earlier. The deaths of his granddaughter, his daughter, and his son-in-law had etched new lines into a face that had already seen more grief than most people accumulated in a lifetime. But his eyes were clear, and his hands, when he folded them in front of him, were steady. He had stopped mourning somewhere in the last 3 weeks. He had started planning instead. You wanted to see me, he said. I'm reactivating your commission, Tanaka said. Full Admiral. Direct authority over the military transition. I need someone who remembers what real war looks like, because we're about to find out whether the rest of us do too. Reyes did not smile. How far are we taking this? All the way, Tanaka said, and led him down through 3 levels of security to a chamber most of the council itself did not know existed. The room, when the final door opened, was full of screens and quiet, focused activity. A single scientist waited for them at the center of it. Dr. Priya Chandrasekhar, chief architect of a classified program most of the galaxy, and most of humanity, had never heard of. Tell him, Tanaka said. Chandrasekhar brought up a holographic schematic that, at first glance, looked almost unremarkable. A slow rotation of 8, labeled planetary bodies, orbiting a single star. This is Project Envil, she said. We started the theoretical groundwork nearly 2 centuries ago, not long after first contact, on the assumption that someday we might face an adversary we couldn't out-negotiate or outmaneuver in the conventional sense, so we built something that conventional sense didn't apply to. Reyes studied the schematic. What does it do? It turns the entire Sol system into a kinetic delivery platform, she said. 4 of the inner planets have spent the last 20 years being nudged, gradually and almost imperceptibly, into magnetic resonance around the sun. Their cores act as current-carrying rails. The sun itself, properly modulated, is the power source. When it fires, It accelerates a solid mass to a meaningful fraction of light speed, and delivers it anywhere within the firing envelope, with enough kinetic energy to crack a planet's crust. In minutes, Reyes was quiet for a long moment. "You built a planet." "We built a species killer," Chandrasekhar corrected. "Without flinching. Paired with our slipstream relay network, we can deliver coordinated strikes to every major Threll world simultaneously. Not sequential engagements, not a campaign measured in years. A single strike window, wide enough to reach every colony, every fleet anchorage, every population center they have at once. The weight of that sat in the room like a physical thing." Reyes thought about Sophia's laugh over the relay feed the last time they'd spoken. He thought about 9 million people dying on a broadcast. The entire galaxy had watched and done nothing to stop. "How soon?" he said. 4 months, if we push everything we have into it." Tanaka stepped closer. "Admiral, I need you to understand what we're choosing here. Once wedo these. There's no walking it back. The galaxy will fear us. Most of it will hate us. We will be functionally alone out there for a generation, maybe longer." Reyes met her eyes. "We were always alone. Madam Secretary de Threll proved that. 50 other species watched 9 million of our people die and didn't move a single ship. Nobody is coming to help us. Nobody ever was. We only have ourselves. We always did." He turned back to the display. "For months, I'll make sure we're ready." While Project Anvil moved toward completion, Earth transformed itself into something none of its own people quite recognized. The recall order had gone out, and humanity had come home hundreds of thousands of colonists, traders, and researchers. Arriving in waves, returning to a homeworld many of them barely remembered, now humming with the sound of a civilization preparing for something it had never prepared for before. Commander Yusuf Ademi had spent 19 years patrolling the quiet borders of human space, a career built on routine and restraint. He was 44, broad-shouldered, known across the fleet for a calm that had never once cracked under pressure. When the recall order reached him, he brought his squadron home without a single question. Now he sat in a briefing room with 60 other commanders, staring at tactical maps of Threll territory that had, until recently, been the kind of maps nobody in human command ever expected to need. "Current intelligence puts their total military strength at roughly 900 capital ships," Ademi told the room, "spread across 3 primary defense fleets, with the bulk anchored around their homeworld and their 5 largest colonies. They believe their core territory is effectively unreachable. Every piece of their doctrine is built on that assumption." Admiral Reyes stood at the front of the room. "They're wrong. In 4 months, we hit everything. Not their fleets first, not a campaign. Everything, all at once. When this is finished, the name Threll will exist in history archives and nowhere else." A younger officer raised a hand. Sir de Concord might try to intervene. Reyes's expression did not change. "The Concord watched 9 million of our people die on a broadcast they had every capability to jam or interrupt, and they did nothing. They will watch the Threll die the same way. Inaction is the one thing they're consistently good at." The meeting ended with a single directive: prepare for total war. Across Earth, factories that had spent decades building consumer infrastructure were retooled overnight for weapons production. Shipyards that had built colony transports began laying down warship hulls. Millions of volunteers, civilian and military alike, stepped forward, not for glory, not even entirely for revenge, but for the simple, grim certainty that no human colony would ever again be left undefended while the rest of the galaxy watched. Concord observers, quietly dispatched to monitor human activity in the weeks that followed, reported back with visible unease. Humans worked around the clock without complaint. They moved with a coordination and unity no other species in Concord history had managed to sustain under this kind of pressure. One observer, an elder of the ancient Solvan species, sent a private message to his own government that would later become one of the most quoted diplomatic cables in Concord history. "Do not interfere with the humans. Do not attempt to slow what they are building. Whatever it is already beyond anyone's capacity to stop. And whatever happens to the Threll Compact, they have earned every part of it." The Threll, for their part, spent those 4 months exactly as they had spent every month before the massacre, expanding into former human trade corridors, mocking humanity's disappearance from Concord affairs as confirmation of their weakness, entirely unaware that their extinction had already been scheduled down to the hour. Not every human agreed with the scale of what was coming. Even in those final months, a minority within the council argued, quietly and at real professional risk, that Project Anvil represented an atrocity in its own right. That answering the murder of 9 million with the deaths of 60 billion was not justice, but a magnitude of retaliation no crime could justify. Regardless of what had prompted it, those arguments were heard, debated in closed session, and ultimately overruled, not because they were dismissed as unreasonable, but because the council concluded, after weeks of genuinely difficult deliberation, that anything less than total and unambiguous consequence would leave humanity permanently vulnerable to the next power that decided a massacre was an acceptable price for territory it wanted. History. Secretary Tanaka told the dissenting members in the session that finally settled the matter. Did not reward species that answered atrocity with proportion. It rewarded species that survived, and made certain no one else ever mistook survival for permission to try again. Quick pause before we go further. If you're new here, this is the part where I ask you to hit subscribe. News stories like this every week, and it genuinely helps more than you'd think. Alright, back to it. 4 months passed like a held breath across a silent earth. Every shipyard glowed around the clock. Every factory hummed without pause. The rest of the Concord, meanwhile, went about its business, trading and arguing and living exactly as it always had. Meridian had already become old news. 9 million dead humans, a tragedy briefly discussed and then quietly filed away, replaced within weeks by fresher, more comfortable gossip. Humanity had not forgotten. Humanity would never forget. Lieutenant Naomi Park stood on the observation deck of the carrier Reckoning, watching Earth shrink to a blue point through the viewport. She was 29, a fighter pilot with steady hands and eyes that had stopped flinching weeks ago. Her older brother, Daniel, had been a marine biologist on Meridian's southern coast. She had watched him die on the broadcast, still trying to shepherd a group of frightened students toward the shelter that hadn't, in the end, saved anyone. She now commanded a squadron of 52 pilots. Every single one of them had lost someone on Meridian. None of them needed a speech to remind them why they were here. Admiral Reyes walked onto the deck beside her. Lieutenant. Squadron ready. She turned and saluted. Ready and waiting, sir? We've been ready for 4 months. He nodded slowly. I understood the way every human on this fleet understood, that this was not simply a military operation. It was a promise made to 9 million ghosts that their deaths would not be met with silence the way the galaxies had been. We launch in 3 hours, he said. Make sure your people eat something. It's going to be a long day. He left her alone with her thoughts. She pulled a worn photograph from her flight jacket. Herself and Daniel, years younger, laughing about something neither of them could remember anymore. Taken during a summer on Meridian's coast, before either of them had known what the word reef would come to mean to them both. I'm coming, she whispered to the photograph. We all are. Across the assembled fleet, 14,000 warships, the largest human force ever gathered in one place. Every vessel carried a small sealed container of soil, gathered by recovery drones from Meridian's ruined coastline after the massacre. It traveled with them into battle, a fragment of the dead world riding alongside the living into whatever came next. Not everyone aboard the fleet was a soldier. Tomasz Weber was a civilian structural engineer, 51 years old, who had spent his career designing seawalls and orbital habitats rather than weapons. When the call for volunteers went out, he had signed up within the hour. His younger sister's entire family had lived on Meridian. None of them had survived. He had been assigned to a support vessel, maintaining engine systems and repair drones alongside soldiers half his age, and nobody on that ship had ever once asked about his qualifications. All that mattered was that he showed up and did the work in front of him. You ever been in a fight before? One of the Marines asked him during a maintenance shift. Tomasz shook his head. Never thrown a punch in my life. The Marine's grin held no real humor in it. You won't need to. We've got something a lot bigger than fists. The fleet moved through the dark, in perfect formation. Thousands of ships and millions of people converging on a single destination. Kethfereth, the Threll homeworld. From Earth, Admiral Reyes watched the fleet's progress on a secure feed. Too old now to lead the assault himself, but having planned every second of it in exquisite detail. Every ship knew its target. Every pilot understood their role. There would be no improvisation and no mercy. Secretary Tanaka stood beside him in the command center. "The Concorde is already asking questions," she said. "They want to know where our fleet is headed." Reyes didn't look away from the screens. "Let him ask. They'll find out soon enough." In a side chamber, Dr. Chandrasekhar monitored Project Anvil's final status. The weapon's activation sequence had been loaded and locked. It would fire once, at a single coordinated moment, and end the Threll compact's capacity to exist as a governing civilization within the hour. "Are we certain about this?" she asked quietly. Not quite a question. 60 billion Threll. We're talking about all of them. Everyone. Everyone. Reyes turned to look at her. His eyes, hard as old stone. They killed 9 million of ours. Children. Infants. They did it on purpose, broadcast across the stars, to prove they could do it without consequence. He stepped closer. "This is the consequence. We're not doing this because it brings us any satisfaction. We're doing it because if we don't, someone else decides we're an easy target next. Some other fleet surrounds some other colony and starts the same broadcast. After today, no one in this galaxy will ever make that mistake again." Chandrasekhar nodded slowly. She understood, the way everyone on that fleet understood. This was not vengeance in the way the word was usually meant. It was a line drawn permanently, in language the entire galaxy would be forced to read whether it wanted to or not. The fleet reached the edge of Threll space. Sensors picked up enemy patrols ahead. The moment had arrived. Admiral Ademi stood on the bridge of his flagship, surrounded by his command staff, watching thousands of tactical icons fill the display around him. He thought of his own family back on Earth. He thought of the families who would never go home again because of what the Threll had chosen to do to them. "Open a fleetwide channel," he said. "Channel open, Admiral." He had prepared remarks weeks earlier. Standing here now, they felt inadequate. So he spoke without them. "Today we fly for Meridian," he said, "for 9 million people who were murdered while the galaxy watched and did nothing." He paused, looking out at the stars ahead of him. The Threll believed they could teach us our place. They believed they could kill our families on a broadcast for the whole galaxy to enjoy, and face no answer for it. They were wrong. We are not here for revenge. We are here to make certain no species in this Concorde ever again believes that killing human civilians costs nothing. He straightened. "All ships, prepare for combat." We translate in 5 minutes. For Earth, for Meridian, for all of us. 14,000 ships answered as one voice. For humanity. The fleet engaged its engines and vanished into the dark, leaving nothing behind but the echo of that answer. Kethverath had stood for 11,000 years as an unbroken fortress. Orbital defense platforms ringed the planet in overlapping fields of fire. 3 war fleets patrolled its approaches without pause. Planetary shields, rated to withstand bombardment capable of cracking small moons, covered every inch of its surface. The Continuity Council had never once seriously entertained the possibility of invasion. Their world was safe. Their people were untouchable. No species in the galaxy possessed the means to threaten them. They were about to learn how wrong that certainty had been. Overseer Vesek Thorn sat in his command chamber reviewing routine reports from the outer territories when his aide entered. "Overseer, long-range sensors have detected a human fleet approaching our space." Thorn's mandibles clicked in something close to amusement. "How many ships?" "Approximately 14,000, Overseer." That gave him a moment's pause. But only a moment. "Impressive. The humans have gathered everything they possess. Dispatch the second defense fleet to intercept. Leave no survivors." "Yes, Overseer." Thorn returned to his reports. The humans were brave, he allowed, foolishly brave, throwing everything they had against a fortress that had never once fallen in 11 millennia. Perhaps, he thought, they preferred to die fighting rather than live in the shame of their defeat. He would grant them that much, at least. The human fleet dropped out of translation at the edge of the Keth system. Admiral Ademi watched the tactical display fill with enemy contacts, 380 Threll warships, moving to intercept 14,000 human vessels. The Threll believed this was strategy. They had no understanding of what was actually about to happen. "Open a broadcast on every available frequency," Ademi ordered. "I want every species in this galaxy watching, the same way they watched Meridian. Channel, open, Admiral, broadcasting across all monitored bands." Ademi looked into the camera, his voice level and unhurried. "This is Admiral Yusuf, Ademi of the United Earth Fleet. 4 months ago, the Threll Compact murdered 9 million human civilians on the colony world of Meridian. They broadcast the massacre across this galaxy as a lesson to every species watching. They wanted humanity to learn its place." He paused. "Today, we teach them theirs. To every species receiving this signal, witness, remember, and understand exactly what happens to those who murder human children for a lesson." The Threll Second Fleet opened fire. Thousands of energy beams lanced across the dark toward the human formation. The battle had begun, though it was not. In truth, the battle either side believed it to be. Naomi Park led her squadron directly into the chaos, her fighter weaving between incoming fire, weapons blazing. Every simulation, every sleepless training cycle of the last 4 months had built toward this exact moment. "Hold formation," she ordered her pilots. "Cover the main fleet. Nothing gets through." The human ships were not fighting to win this engagement outright. They were fighting to hold the Threll's attention, to keep every sensor, every targeting system, every ounce of Threll command focus locked on the obvious threat in front of them, while the real weapon moved quietly into position at the center of the formation. A single, unremarkable transport, carrying no meaningful weapons and only minimal shielding, powered up its systems. Inside its unassuming hull rode the most devastating instrument humanity had ever built. Dr. Chandrasekhar watched the operation unfold from Earth, her pulse hammering. "Anvil is in firing position," she reported, awaiting authorization. Admiral Reyes stood beside Secretary Tanaka in the command center. This was the moment with no path back from it. Tanaka gave a single, slow nod. Reyes spoke into the relay. "Admiral Adejimi, you are authorized to deploy Project Anvil. God forgive us all." On the bridge of his flagship, Ademi received the order. He closed his eyes for a single breath, thinking of everyone who had died on Meridian's coast. Then he opened them and gave the command that would end a civilization. Fire. The weapon did not look dramatic. A thin beam of light, barely visible against the darkness, crossed their battle unnoticed, ignored by Threll gunners, too consumed by the fight in front of them to register it. It struck Cathverit's planetary seals for less than a second. Then the shields simply ceased to exist, punched through as though they were paper, and the beam continued down through the atmosphere, through the cities, through the crust, all the way to the planet's core. The core destabilized within seconds. Fissures split across the surface of a world that had stood unbroken for 11,000 years. Cities that predated most of the Concord's written history collapsed into rubble oceans boiling. Mountain ranges folded inward under gravitational stress that should have been physically impossible. Overseer Vesic, Thorn had perhaps 11 seconds to understand what was happening before his command chamber was torn apart, along with everything else on his dying world. But Project Anvil had never been built to end one planet. It had been built to end a species. Using the slipstream relay network Chandrasekhar's teams had spent decades preparing. Coordinated human strike forces translated simultaneously into every Threll colony, every outpost, every anchored fleet across their entire territory. The attacks were precise and utterly unwarned. On Threll Colony 7, home to nearly 2 billion, the sky ignited as human warships appeared in orbit. On the border outposts designated Keth Station 12, Marines breached the hull before a single defender reached their weapons. Along the outer patrol lines, Threll ships were destroyed before they could transmit so much as a distress call. This was not war. War implies battles, implies the possibility of victory and defeat measured on both sides. This was an ending. Across the wider Concord, sensor networks and monitoring stations picked up fragments of what was happening in near real time, relayed world to world faster than any single government could fully process it. On dozens of unrelated worlds, delegates and citizens alike found themselves watching, in scattered and unofficial broadcasts. The same category of horror the galaxy had watched on Meridian for months earlier. This time inverted, this time absolute. This time without a single voice on the winning side. There was no gloating transmission from the human fleet. No triumphant commentary, just coordinates, going dark, one after another, across an empire that had stood for 3,000 years. Tomasz Weber watched from his support vessel as a Threll colony transport, full of families fleeing toward what they believed was safety, was surrounded and destroyed. For one long moment, something in him recoiled. Then he thought of his sister's family, of watching them die on a broadcast the Threll had chosen to send to the entire galaxy for entertainment, and he looked away and returned to the work in front of him. There would be time to sit with what this had cost him, later. Not today. The operation lasted 2 hours and 51 minutes. When indeed the Threll Compact no longer existed. 60 billion lives ended in a single coordinated strike across dozens of worlds. Their cities burned. Their fleets drifted empty and dark. Their name passed, within hours, from a governing power into history. Admiral Adami stood on his bridge, staring at the debris field where Kethfrith had been. His hands were shaking. He had just presided over the single greatest act of destruction in the recorded history of the galaxy. He did not regret it. He could not let himself regret it. Not after what had been done first. "Send word to Earth," he said quietly. "Tell them it's finished." Meridian is answered. Admiral Reyes received the message alone in his office, a photograph of Sophia on the desk in front of him. For the first time in 4 months, tears moved down his face. "That was for you," he whispered to the photograph. "That was for all of you." The Concorde watched what had happened in a silence, with no precedent. The lesson had been delivered, and it would never be forgotten by anyone who had watched it happen. If the scale of what just happened is landing the way I hope, drop a like and let me know in the comments what you thought. All right, let's see how the galaxy responds. The Concorde's central chamber had never fallen this quiet. Representatives of 50 species sat in their designated seats, staring at displays that had, until recently, shone Threll territory, and now showed nothing but debris fields and dead worlds. 60 billion Threll, erased in under 3 hours. Elder Asara of the Solven was the oldest being in the chamber, her species having lived among the stars for over 50,000 years. She had watched empires rise and fall across that span. She had never witnessed anything resembling this. "They didn't just defeat them," whispered the Krelith ambassador. "They erased them. Entirely." "This is madness," said the Torvanian representative, his crystalline scales rippling visibly with fear. "They must be contained before they do this to someone else." Voices rose across the chamber, fear tangled with anger, demands for immediate condemnation mixed with calls for caution. A handful of representatives sitting in stunned, wordless silence. Then the chamber doors opened, and Ambassador Renata Silva walked in. She was 46, a career diplomat who had spent 2 decades building bridges between species, who had genuinely believed, before Meridian, in the power of negotiation to solve almost anything. The massacre had ended that belief. She had come today to deliver something else entirely. She walked to the human platform at the chamber center and stood alone before 50 alien delegations, showing no trace of fear. "Thank you for receiving me," she said. Her voice was calm and carried to every corner of the room. The Torvanian representative rose immediately. "You dare stand here after what your species has done? This was genocide. You will answer for this." Renata met his gaze without flinching. "Genocide. Let's talk about that word properly." She activated the central display. Footage from Meridian filled the chamber. The killing, the screaming, children shot while trying to run. This was broadcast to every species in this room. Every one of you watched it. For 71 hours, 9 million of our people were murdered systematically. Men, women, children, infants. The Threll didn't hide what they were doing. They wanted all of you to see it. They wanted every species watching to understand what happens to those who defy them. She let the images continue a moment longer. "And what did any of you do?" Silence answered her. "Nothing," she said. "Not one of you spoke out. Not one ambassador filed a formal protest. Not one fleet moved to help us. You watched our people die, and then you went back to your trade disputes as though nothing had happened. The Krelith ambassadors shifted uncomfortably. We could not intervene. The Threll were too powerful. Any interference meant war with them. Renata's smile carried no warmth. Exactly. They were too powerful. Now they are nothing. Now they are dust and archive footage. And you want to call our answer a crime? She stepped forward, her voice hardening. Let me be very clear. What happened to the Threll was not madness, and it was not revenge. It was a message, the same kind of message they tried to send us first. The message is this: humanity will never again allow its civilians to be slaughtered without consequence. Any species that attacks our colonies, that murders our children to prove a point, will face exactly what the Threll faced. We have the capability. We have the will. And we have now demonstrated, beyond any argument, that we are prepared to use both. The Torvenian representative found his voice again. You are threatening this entire Concord. I am not threatening anyone, Renata said. I am making you a promise. Leave us alone, and we will leave you alone. Trade with us, honestly, and we will trade with you, honestly. Treat our people with basic respect, and we will extend the same in return. We do not want conquest. We do not want war. We want, more than anything else, to simply be left in peace. She paused. But peace, from this point forward, has a price. And the price is this: no one touches our civilians, not for any reason, not for any grievance, ever again. Meet that condition, and humanity will be the most reliable ally any of you could ask for. File to meet it, and you have already seen exactly what we are capable of. Elder Isara rose slowly from her seat and crossed to the center of the chamber, her ancient robes trailing behind her, facing Ambassador Silva with eyes that had witnessed more of galactic history than any human alive could comprehend. You have made your point, human, she said. The galaxy will remember what happened here today for as long as it exists, but I wonder whether you understand fully what path you have chosen. You have made yourselves feared. You have made yourselves alone. Every delegation in this chamber will look at your species from now on and see not a partner, but a threat that must be carefully managed. Renata inclined her head. I know. I wish it were different. I mean that honestly, but we did not choose this path first. The Threll chose it for us when they murdered 9 million of our people for entertainment. And this chamber chose it for us too, the day it watched that broadcast and decided doing nothing was easier than doing anything at all. Something like sorrow moved briefly across her face. We learned something on Meridian that we will not unlearn. In this galaxy no one protects us, but ourselves. No one ever has. The only difference now is that we've stopped pretending otherwise. Elder Isara was quiet for a long moment before inclining her head in return. Perhaps you are right. Perhaps this chamber failed you, and failed itself, long before today. But hear this in turn. Fear makes an unstable foundation for any lasting peace. One day the fear will fade. What happens then? Renata considered the question seriously. Then we will need to build something better to replace it. Trust, maybe understanding in time. But those things require years and proof, and neither of us has either of those yet. For now, fear is what we have. It will have to be enough to keep the peace until something sturdier can grow underneath it. She turned toward the chamber doors, then paused and looked back at the assembled delegations one final time. We did not want this. We did not ask for any part of it, but we will not apologize for surviving, and we will not apologize for protecting our own people, and we will never forget what this Concord did and did not do when we needed it most. She left the chamber, and the silence that followed her out lasted long after the doors had closed. 1 year after the massacre, a memorial was constructed at the coordinates where Meridian had once orbited its star. It took the shape of a hollow sphere adrift in open space, holding 9 million individual points of light, one for every life lost in those 71 hours. Earth law required every passing vessel to dim its engines in respect as it crossed the system, a quiet, universal instruction that the rest of the galaxy, whatever else it thought of humanity now, largely chose to honor. Naomi Park visited the memorial on the first anniversary, drifting in front of the sphere for hours, watching the lights shift and glimmer like a captured field of stars. Somewhere among them was her brother's light. She liked to believe it was one of the brighter ones, though she knew, rationally, that the sphere hadn't been built to distinguish between them that way. Some beliefs weren't really about being rational. On Earth, children now studied the Threll Compact in history classes, alongside a careful, honest accounting of what humanity had done in answer. Some students came away proud, some came away troubled, uncertain whether the scale of the response had matched the scale of the crime, or exceeded it in ways their teachers encouraged them to sit with rather than resolve too quickly. All of them understood, by the time they finished the unit, that the galaxy had changed permanently on the day Meridian burned, and again, more permanently still. On the day the Threll Compact stopped existing, every species with a file on humanity in the Concord's shared archive added a new entry in the months that followed. The wording varied by species and by translation, but the substance was identical wherever it appeared. Do not provoke them. Do not test the limits of their patience, and under no circumstance harm their children, because if you do, they will not stop until your entire civilization is memory and debris field. This is not phrased as a threat. It is simply, now, an established fact about what they are. Admiral Marcus Reyes retired for the final time 18 months after Meridian, this time with no intention of ever being recalled again. He spent his remaining years in a small house outside Geneva, tending a garden that reminded him, in small ways, of the blue-green forests his granddaughter had loved. He kept her photograph on his desk until the day he died. He never once said publicly whether he believed what humanity had done was justice or merely the only answer a broken system had left available. Privately, to the handful of people who ever asked him directly, he gave the same answer every time. I don't know if it was right, he'd say. I know it was necessary by the time it happened. I know I'd choose it again tomorrow if it meant no other grandfather ever has to watch what I watched. Whether that makes it right is a question for people with more time left than I have to sit with it. Renata Silva remained the Concorde's senior human ambassador for the rest of her career, and spent much of that career doing something almost nobody in the wider galaxy expected of her. Quietly, patiently, working to build the trust she had told Elder Asada would eventually need to replace fear. It was slow work, unglamorous work, the kind that never made a broadcast anyone across the stars would stop to watch. She did it anyway, year after year, because she understood better than most that a peace built only on fear had an expiration date, and she intended to make sure humanity had something sturdier standing by the time it arrived. Humanity, in the years that followed, never built a second anvil. It never needed to. The Concorde's other members, whatever else they thought of the species that had answered a massacre with the extinction of an empire 3,000 years older than itself, learned very quickly not to test whether the first one had been an aberration or a promise. It had been a promise. Every species that came into contact with humanity after that understood, whether they liked it or not, that the price of peace with Earth was simple, non-negotiable, and permanently non-refundable. Leave the children alone, or answer for it the way the Threll had. Dr. Chandrasekhar spent the remainder of her career on a project she never publicized and rarely discussed even with colleagues. A set of formal, exhaustive technical safeguards designed to ensure that Project Anvil, or anything resembling it, could never again be authorized by a single crisis, a single bote, or a single grieving council in the space of a single emergency session. She believed, as deeply as she believed anything, that the weapon had been necessary the one time it was used. She believed just as deeply that a species which built something capable of ending a civilization needed permanent, structural reasons never to reach for it casually again. Her final report on the subject, submitted the year before her retirement, closed with a single line that several later historians would cite as the truest thing anyone ever wrote about what humanity had built and why. We did not build Anvil to be strong. We built it so we would never again have to find out what it felt like to be weak while the galaxy watched. Humanity had learned exactly what it was capable of when the galaxy pushed it too far, and the galaxy, in turn, had learned something it would never again allow itself to forget. Thanks for sticking with this one, all the way to the end. It means a lot. If this story hit for you, drop a like, subscribe for more stories like it every week, and let me know down in the comments what you'd want to see explored next in this universe. See you in the next one.